Juan Ponce Enrile's life ended quietly on an afternoon that would immediately ripple through every layer of Philippine society, from political elites who had worked with him or against him, to historians who had chronicled his complicated legacy, to survivors of martial law whose bodies and memories still carried the weight of decisions he once justified. His daughter, Juan Ponce Enrile, delivered the news through a simple but emotionally heavy post on her Facebook page, stating that her father passed away at 4:21 p.m. 0821 GMT, at home, surrounded by our family. She also noted there would be a public viewing, an acknowledgement that Enrile was not merely a private figure but a man whose influence, decisions, alliances, and betrayals had shaped the nation for more than half a century. His final days were spent battling pneumonia, a condition that weakened him in ways that political storms never had. For decades he had walked through conflicts, political, ideological, personal, with a posture that suggested invincibility. Yet in the end, he slipped away in the presence of family, in quietness rather than turbulence, in stillness rather than the chaos that had marked so much of his public life. The announcement of his death immediately summoned echoes of a complex past. Juan Ponce Enrile was known worldwide as the architect of Marcos-era martial law, a pivotal figure who used his Harvard-trained intellect to craft, justify, and implement one of the most repressive chapters in Philippine history. He was the legal mind behind the machinery of control that clamped down on dissent, imprisoned journalists, activists, students, academics, labor leaders, and civilians, and protected the authoritarian rule of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. The term architect was not simply metaphorically pointed to the deliberate, structured, academically framed legal foundation he built to allow Marcos to wield near absolute power, suppress opposition, and reshape the country into a landscape where fear, silence, and state dominance became everyday realities. To Enrile's supporters, he was a brilliant strategist, a resilient political force, and a man who understood the intricacies of law, governance, and security. To his critics, many of whom had been imprisoned, tortured, displaced, or bereaved during martial law, he was a symbol of tyranny, repression, manipulation, and political opportunism. For them, his name carried pain. It carried unanswered questions. It carried memories of a time when the government held the power to decide who lived freely, who disappeared into the night, who never returned home, and who would be reshaped by fear for the rest of their life. These two narratives, admiration and condemnation, collided sharply the moment his death was announced, creating an immediate contrast between those mourning statesmanlike contributions and those remembering only wounds. What made Enrile even more complicated was the dramatic shift he made later in life. He eventually turned on the very regime he had helped build. In the years leading up to the 1986 People Power Revolution, tensions between him and Marcos intensified, suspicions grew, power dynamics shifted. The political machine that once felt stable and unified began to fracture beneath its own weight. Enrile, once a loyal pillar of the dictatorship, defected at a critical moment. His breakaway, alongside General Fidel Ramos, became the spark that ignited the mass uprising. Millions of Filipinos would eventually fill EDSA with prayers, courage, and collective strength, forcing Marcos into exile and restoring democratic institutions. Enrile's name, ironically, shifted in that moment from one associated with repression to one tied to rebellion against authoritarianism. But this transformation did not erase the past, and for many Filipinos, his participation in the uprising was not viewed as an act of heroism but as a calculated move, a strategic repositioning once his relationship with Marcos became untenable. To them, his defection was not an act of moral awakening but a manifestation of his political instinct. He knew when to stay, when to step back, and when to leap to a new side to secure relevance and power. The same man who had helped Marcos consolidate authoritarian rule now played a crucial role in dismantling it. This contradiction would define him for the rest of his life. After the revolution, Enrile continued to navigate the shifting corridors of political power. He aligned himself with new leaders, took on roles that re-established him in the political mainstream, and once again became a major political player. But one of the most astonishing twists came years later. He would eventually help the Marcos family stage a remarkable political comeback. After their return from exile, the Marcoses slowly rebuilt their influence, regained key political positions, and reasserted themselves into national politics. And standing among their allies, offering advice, lending credibility, connecting old networks, was Juan Ponce Enrile, the man who helped crush dissent to keep the Marcoses in power, then helped remove them, now helped rehabilitate them. It was a cycle that bewildered some, angered others, and prompted many to question whether Enrile's shifting loyalties reflected genuine belief or a lifelong pattern of aligning himself with whichever political force ensured his survival. The story did not end there. When Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son of the late dictator, won the 2022 presidential election, he appointed Enrile as his chief legal counsel. At this point, Enrile was nearly 100 years old, a longevity not just in life, but in political relevance that few historical figures ever achieve. Marcos Jr. issued a statement following Enrile's passing, calling him one of the most enduring and respected public servants our country has ever known, and adding that Enrile dedicated his life to serving the Filipino people, helping guide the country through some of its most challenging and defining moments. From the son of the man whose regime Enrile had both protected and later abandoned, the words carried both political gratitude and historical irony, but not everyone mourned. Bonifacio, head of a group of former dissidents who had been thrown into prison during martial law, released a statement that cut through any attempt to romanticize Enrile's legacy. His words reflected deeply personal wounds shared by thousands of martial law victims. The group had no tears to shed for Enrile, Elegant said. For them, he will forever be remembered neither as a patriot nor a statesman, but as one of the chief architects and defenders of tyranny, repression, and corruption in the country. This condemnation was not rooted in ideology but in lived experience, years spent behind bars, interrogations, torture, psychological trauma, and the loss of loved ones. To these survivors, Enrile's death was not the passing of a hero or even a controversial elder statesman. It was the fading of a man whose policies and decisions had carved herself into their pasts in ways they could never escape. To expand Enrile's story fully is to trace the long, winding, often contradictory arc of power. His life illustrated the kind of political resilience that is rare. He remained relevant for decades, not because he stayed loyal to one belief, one ideology, or one political family, but because he knew how to adapt. He understood how political winds shifted, how public sentiment evolved, how alliances could crumble and rebuild. He navigated crises like a man who had studied them, lived through them, and, in many cases, designed them. And through all of this, he somehow maintained an image, at least to his supporters, of a strong, unwavering defender of the nation's interests. Yet to his critics, Enrile represented something far more chilling, the embodiment of political survival at any cost. Even when survival meant participating in repression, justifying violence, or enabling corruption, he was not merely a character in Philippine political history. He was a symbol of an entire era, its ambitions, its darkness, its brutality, its upheaval, its reinventions. When he died at home, surrounded by family, as Katrina's message stated, it marked the close of not just a life but a long chapter in the political narrative of the Philippines. His passing brought no universal sentiment, a fracture of emotions that mirrored the fracture of history he helped shape. Some mourned, some reflected, some felt vindicated, some felt indifferent, and some remembered memories so painful that mourning felt impossible.